Hi, I'm Jenny Beard. I'm a painter. I would consider myself a painter's painter. I work primarily in contemporary abstract, and my work borders between traditional painting and digital painting. I'm interested in the push and pull between those two practices, and I'm interested in making paintings about paintings, so I take the gestures of abstract and action painting, and I kind of do this reverse entropy to simplify them and make them a symbol of themselves. So the relationship between traditional and digital painting, I find it really interesting. I work on an iPad, and obviously I work on canvas as well. And the things that I can do on the iPad that I'm then trying to replicate on canvas and vice versa, I find that really interesting, but the end result is something that borders both. When you see it online, as most of us view artwork, it could look like a digital flat painting. But when you see it in person, you see all the nuances you get with traditional painting, the textures, the sheens, the viscosity of the paint. So I find that push and pull between the two really good. So I tend to get motivated by action painting because it's something very freeing. So I would say I'm not throwing paint around like Pollock, but I'm creating these automatic drawings. And they're very freeing. I don't have to think. I can switch off, kind of get into a rhythm. And then that hard part is done. I've created the image, and then it's just the process of refining it. And that's quite logical. And that's something I love. I love creating logic out of chaos. So there's a fine line with the chaos in my work. I don't like things to look perfect. So I don't want to create a perfectly shaped painting blob, because then I might as well just create digital works in themselves. And it's the same with the colours. I want the colours to kind of balance each other, but not too perfectly. So by using digital things such as an iPad, I can really play with the palette and select some kind of dirgy colours or clashing colours and really see how they buzz against each other. I want the painting to have this little kind of buzz on the surface that stops it looking too balanced and too perfect, which is what can happen with digital works. I've been painting my whole life, but before university I painted mostly portraits, so it's really interesting to get to university and really try and challenge myself, because the portraits weren't that challenging. And I started photographing graffiti or sgraffito, or just marks I came across in the street, accidental artworks I would call them. And through this visual diary I kind of built up a language of marks, and I would create paintings inspired directly from those. And again, with the reverse entropy that I do on my most recent works, I was doing that back then. I was taking a very messy source image and simplifying it and scaling it up. And I found that really interesting. That's something that's obviously stuck with me. I don't work directly from graffiti now, but it has definitely influenced the way I make marks on the page. What really got me into abstraction was just playing about with paint. So I found myself painting large scale on the floor with mops, throwing paint around and just really having fun and not worrying about the result. And some of that freedom just took me down the abstract expressionism route, and I would say now I'm coming out of that and I've found my own niche within contemporary painting. But yeah, just throwing paint around, I still like to do it sometimes, but in a much more controlled manner. There's no mops anymore.
Hi, I'm Alice Chandler. I'm an artist from Leeds. I studied sculpture at the University of Edinburgh and graduated there in 2015. For the past 6 years I've been working as an artist and in a gallery doing curatorial things. I recently graduated from the University of Leeds MA Art Gallery Museum Studies, and I am now a postgraduate researcher at the University of Leeds in the School of Performance and Cultural Industries, and I'm researching artist networks in Yorkshire. So I sort of have a hybrid practice as an artist and a researcher. So my practice, I'm interested in art, craft, design, and sort of the crossover between those those three disciplines. I make objects that sort of interrogate our relationship with the domestic, the wearable. I ask questions about value and display and object history and what objects mean. With my work, I'm quite interested in design and how things can be functional, so I often make things which, I guess, dependent on how you display them. They can be like sculptural or functional or decorative, or then they could have another life outside of the gallery. I find that kind of process of making things that can be used quite interesting, and I think that comes into my practice. I use a lot of craft processes. I'm interested in sort of learning about the history of craft processes, skilling myself up. I quite often work with textiles, and I like the sort of associations that can bring to like comfort and home and like domesticity, but I might often combine those with, I don't know, like a large scale steel structure. I think I'm interested in making small things and things that ask questions about value, but I'm also interested in making things that are quite sculptural and play on our like perception of space and what objects are that we have, you know, at home that might be really familiar, that can then become just slightly like tweaked to be slightly different, that make you look at something and think, oh, what's that and what does that have links to? I think one thing that I'm always kind of thinking about is how I can place things in juxtaposition or in dialogue, so they start to sort of create this narrative that makes us think about what we like experience every day. My mum is a quilter and my grandma was a quilter, and I'm quite interested in like generational sort of craft that gets passed down. I'm interested in Leeds and its textile history. It's kind of was like a mass city for the production, not only the production of textiles, but it had like massive tailoring industry as well, which sort of, I feel like all of this sort of stuff feeds in. I'm interested in that sense in like hierarchy of materials and what's precious and what's not precious, and I think that becomes a really interesting dialogue when you start to like go bigger. I like making installations that can combine small and large, so there becomes this sort of narrative between these really kind of domestic precious objects and then these like larger works. So the work that I'm displaying at Messams is a sort of series. I guess I work in sculptural series quite a lot. I see that a lot of my work, each piece connects on from the last piece, and then not necessarily like completely separate pieces, and they can be kind of reinterpreted or rearranged like into a different space, particularly with these pieces because they're all sort of based around furniture or objects that you would have in the home. So the large blue piece is based on a trouser press that you would have maybe in a hotel, so it has this kind of really masculine connotation to it. And then the shelves with really small handmade objects start to ask questions about display and storage and how we present objects. I'm quite interested in how when we sort of curate our homes, these objects start to make up a sort of narrative about ourselves, and thinking about how we can reinterpret that or redisplay that.
Hi, I'm Simon Crawford and I'm working in Knaresborough. I've been here for about 25 years. I ramble through the countryside and I visit churches and I go on long walks all over the place, and somehow the magic of the countryside, the architecture, people, places, where I'm going infuses into the work. It's not always obvious, I don't think, and in many cases it takes a long time to realise that actually something that I've made does make a connection with the landscape or the people that I see or meet around the place. The work is about the substance of it, how it's made, what's going on is relevant, but that's not what I'm thinking about really. I'm enjoying the lusciousness of the materials and those things. That's how I relate to the landscape, I think, and people, glimpses of figures. I switch from really small scale works, drawings, pen and ink. It's quicker and easier to get something out quickly because I work very, very fast. But I also do big charcoal drawings. I did a series of drawings about English cathedrals, following kind of in the footsteps of Dennis Crefeld. The paint, in terms of using oil paint on a big scale, I like the physicality of it. It's a very, you work up a sweat when you are actually confronted by a 6-foot canvas. And I like that gestural thing. It's the kind of width of my arms. The way I'm working is a bit like with the Roman Catholic Church, where they have transubstantiation. It's a similar process where you have the substance and you're trying to remake something. You're trying to make it real on the canvas, and that's a weird thing to try and do on a two-dimensional surface. And I think I work in series. I mix up a whole load of colour at the beginning. I've got a whole load of canvases waiting to go now, and I'll mix up tons of colour, and almost when that colour's finished, the series is finished. It can't go any further. The colour is done. The mood is done, and the feeling is done. It's gone, and you can't get it back. When I'm working, it's very easy to get lost in a kind of miasma of ideas and colour, and the paint's going everywhere. You're completely unconscious. Well, I am anyway. I'm completely unconscious about what I'm doing. It's very frustrating at times when things don't go well, or you think that they're not going well. I mean, here's another weird thing, that actually when the things that you think have gone really badly, actually you leave it for a couple of weeks and you wonder how you ever made it, because it actually looks all right. But it's a process which seems to be intuitive, but I'm not entirely sure that it is. It's born of 30, 40 years of messing around on canvas, really, and drawing. And there was, when I went to art school, there was disciplined in a way in terms of drawing, quite traditional, I suppose. But it was useful because it apart from anything else, it shows you how to look at things, and what you're doing after that is transforming the things that you're looking at in a very personal way. And I think that's the core of this. It's a personal thing. It's a personal statement about not just what I'm looking at, really, because you'd be hard pressed to recognise a place. It's a feeling when one is in that place. Howard Hodgkin talks about it a lot. That memory of a feeling that you get.
Hello, I'm Lisa. I'm a painter based in Manchester. I'm currently working from OA Studios. I make generally small-scale abstract paintings with a geometric element kind of paired with a more spontaneous painterly approach, gestural mark. And what I'm really thinking about in those pieces is, I suppose, the contrast and creating a sense of tension maybe between the sort of framing devices and then the gestural marks themselves. I like to try and be really spontaneous, so initially what I'll start doing is laying down some of the gestural marks and just being as free as I can with that. I work with paper cutouts, so I use these on top of the surface when the gestural marks are dried, just to kind of plan out the composition and test out variations of that and just see what's going to work. I just like to experiment with the materials, really, and if I feel drawn to a particular material, I'll just kind of go with that and just see what happens, because it's when sort of accidents happen and you can sort of orchestrate that, it sort of adds to your skill set. I love it when something unexpected happens, and I always want to be surprised as part of the process. So I think that comes from really trying to be experimental with bringing in new materials. For example, I work with Paper Gallery in Manchester, so that was almost like, obviously there has to be an emphasis of paper, but bringing in that kind of collage element, it sort of opened things up for me, and I was thinking about the different ways that I could use materials. And I work quite a lot on sandpaper, which is just, really wonderful to paint onto. So I'm really sort of going with my intuition a lot of the time, and my choices of materials, I suppose. A lot of the kind of processes that I use, they've kind of come from maybe past events. And just for example, my mum used to make cakes when I was a child, so I always work with the paintings on the horizontal on the table, and it's almost like icing a cake in a way. So I think that seems quite natural to me, to work in that way, and you know, even down to sometimes using icing tools and things like that. And then you get the elements of the paint sort of spilling over the edges, and that's a really important aspect, because I think it you know, gives an indication of the process, and I want people to sort of perceive that in the work. And I'm interested in just little things under the surface being visible and kind of hints at what's gone on as part of the process. So I want those kind of things to be on the surface and almost like excavated. That's something I'm really interested in, and I hope that people would kind of get that from the work. I like to be surprised, and I like to not quite know exactly how a painting's going to turn out. So at one point I was making these quite specific grid-like paintings. That was when I first moved to Manchester after uni, and I think that was partly to do with architectural elements of the city and those hard lines feeding in. But that kind of got boring quite quickly, because I knew exactly, you know, how the painting would turn out when it was finished. I could just visualise it, so there's almost no point in making the painting. So now I just want to have that element of kind of letting the materials lead the way and seeing what happens, and that sort of throws up new possibilities and new directions quite organically. I kind of, I can see the difference between, you know, when I've lived in different locations. So they changed when I moved to Manchester, and that was when I started making completely abstract work, because it was landscape, kind of semi-abstract landscape when I was at university. And then they changed again. I lived in Berlin for a couple of years, and I saw a lot of exhibitions around kind of digital aesthetics. So that sort of, those sorts of screen aesthetics started to feed into the work, and signs and symbols and logos, maybe from the graffiti around the city. So I can see definitely different periods in the work, so it's interesting to kind of see them all together, and what I think of as quite different work, actually you can see the similarities as well, and the sort of continuation. Well, I think I got a bit addicted to these kind of fluorescent colours. I think it was on a residency my first year in Berlin, and I was working in the basement of a gallery, and it was winter, and it was really dark and cold in the city, and I think it was almost like therapy for me. Just these colours, I just really got addicted to working with them, and I just wanted to see how far I could push that. And I think I brought in the filler after that, and that's just really satisfying to kind of work with, because it's more like a physical object. You know, you kind of create this sort of denseness, and the way that you can apply it is, I think there's a real kind of spontaneity, it allows for that. I think the work has changed again, you know, just in terms of colour since I've been back in Manchester as well. I've noticed it kind of shift a little bit, but the sort of bright colours, the neons, they've sort of stayed the constant. There's this particular sort of Manchester green that I just associate with Manchester. It's quite dark. Might not be in like some of these pieces. It's in some of the work that's in the studio now, and I don't know, it seems to come out in the work of a few painters. It's just something I've noticed. For me, it's kind of more general, and I can just see certain elements kind of, you know, popping out of the pieces. I really like the fact that they are open to interpretation, and someone viewing them is going to look at them in a completely different way to how I have when I've made them, because they're bringing their own experiences to looking at the work.
Hi, I'm Ian Jackson. I'm an artist based in Leeds. I predominantly make work about collections of materials. I follow these materials to unravel their histories and pervasive use. My current work revolves around a vein of limestone that runs from South Shields to Nottingham, and my work is exploring the wider effects and impact this has on the landscape, buildings and society. So the work I'm showing is based on architectural templates used by stonemasons at York Minster to recreate parts of the building that are being repaired in the facade. The masons have developed this process where they create these zinc templates and profiles which hold the geometries of the building themselves. So they're drawing templates, practical tools, but also blueprints, and hold information about the architecture of the building. The works in this exhibition explore these forms and create new profiles, templates and shapes that kind of depict parts of the building that people would normally not be able to see. So the work started off from a coincidence, a visit to a open stone day at the York Minster, where people can buy pieces of York Minster at auction that are being sold off to help fund the restoration of the building. After purchasing and collecting a few pieces of this building, through a kind of just general interest, I became fascinated by the wider uses of this material. So the work's more about kind of following this material and uncovering its wider histories. Part of that involves learning about the ways it's used, but a lot of my work is about kind of processing these techniques and information and finding my own ways of working with material. So the zinc works in the exhibition I've produced in a very particular way that has kind of developed from techniques that the master mason would use, but I've kind of brought them into kind of my own. So the master mason uses an etching solution to actually mark and code all of the templates that they use at the Minster, and I've kind of built on that and started using etching processes and copper sulfate to etch images and kind of registration marks into my templates to kind of show more of the process behind them and how they might be used and how they're stored. I feel like there's always like a process of discovery to making work, and a lot of it is quite slow, methodical work, especially kind of making these templates and cutting them out by hand, but there's also like an element of risk. So when you kind of etch these pieces, there's a risk that it won't work out and you've kind of have to put all the effort on the line. So I think there's something nice about kind of dipping something in solution or cutting something in half to like reveal something you don't know if it's going to work out or not. So you're kind of, through this process of discovery and kind of risk, you're kind of re-evaluating and re-understanding and learning something new and kind of physically opening up this material to be viewed in a different way by other people.
Hi, my name's Connor Shields. I'm an artist based in Leeds and my work focuses on working class masculinity. The materials that I typically use are concrete and industrial materials, metal, and I juxtapose it with the soft handcrafted materials such as knitting and handmade rope. I like the conversation that occurs when you place these two types of materials together. At first they're very opposing in their physical qualities, but then they actually work together quite harmoniously and it creates quite an interesting conversation between the two materials. I use a lot of ready-made objects and objects that actually do occur within industry. So I sort of use cinder blocks and I use foundation blocks and like pieces of metal what would actually be used in construction sites. And then what I do is I play around with how I can manipulate these objects and how I can alter them and how they can be combined with all of the softer side. I think the work is quite subtle. I'm also trying to highlight some of these ideas that we had when I was growing up in Middlesbrough. A lot of the ideas of what is masculine, what is feminine, and sort of subverting these ideas. So a lot of the time I will make the softer objects be the stronger elements and there will be the supportive elements. And then sometimes I will cast concrete but make it look soft like a pillow as if something's been pressed into it. So I sort of alter the perceptions that we do have of the materials. By putting the materials together that I do, it does make us question these ideas that we do have. So for instance, the concrete blocks, you sort of think of construction, you think of working men, you think of builders, and also, but then when you put it with the softer knitting, I think it makes us question like, well, why do we perceive this object to be this way? A lot of the influence for my work comes from construction sites and a lot of assemblages that you see around these sites. So I always go around and I take pictures of these sites of piles of bricks or the way that something's leaning against the wall or like these often quite contrasting materials that you wouldn't see together. Yeah. And with construction sites there's always this degree of precision that needs to be achieved, but around this precision there's all of this almost chaos and a lot of these makeshift things. There could be a fence that's trying to be held up and it just has things stacked against it, which I think is the opposite of what the building is actually. It's like the chaos that occurs around this precision. Leeds is undergoing a huge city renovation right now, and that's why there's so much construction going on around the city, and that's something that I find really interesting to my work. And you can just walk around anywhere and I'm finding all this inspiration which feeds back into the work. I let my practice sort of take me where it goes. I don't really have a vision of where I want to be, so it evolves quite naturally. I get inspired by all these often mundane things, but I just sort of take these mundane objects, and it's the exploration of it. That's what I find the most exciting, is actually getting in the studio and taking these objects and thinking, how can I combine them together? And I'll put them into a certain sculpture, and then I'll take it apart and I'll do something else. So the exploration is one of the most important parts of making for me. With the work, I do have all these ideas that do inform the work around sort of gender theory, around class, but I sometimes like the work to speak for itself, and I don't always want to prescribe what it is, and I'm quite interested to hear other people's interpretations of it, but there is obviously all of this influence from my upbringing. I think it's interesting because artists get to make comments on the world in a more subtle way or in a different way that other people do.
My name's Christopher Tansey and I'm a painter and I live in East Yorkshire. My paintings are explorations of and deal with existence, memory, experience and being sentient, and in my own way I'm exploring and trying to make sense of that through paint and painting. My paintings are also explorations of the materials that I use, their materiality and intrinsic nature and how they behave when used. So currently I am solely painting on paper with mixed media, acrylic paint, household paint, spray paint even. And I find that paper is much more, for me personally, much more of an interesting surface to paint on. Canvas I find to be obviously very flat, whereas paper crinkles, it droops, it tears, it saturates, which, you know, I thoroughly enjoy the struggle with that when I'm painting to ultimately, you know, come up with a painting that I'm happy with. At university, obviously, we were taught and, you know, and told to use traditional surfaces, canvas, wood, etc. But I remember having an incredibly interesting conversation with one of my lecturers that's really stayed with me about the isness of a material, what that material is, what it does, what happens when paint or something is applied to that surface or that material. And that's really stuck with me 30 years on. I'm particularly interested in the isness of paper. And once I started experimenting and painting with paper, on paper, I decided that that's what I would like to, you know, work on solely. A lot of my work is based around memory, experience, person, place. It's quite hard to put my finger on exactly where that comes from and how that feeds into my work, but I certainly know it does. I rely on childhood memories and experiences, holidays, where I grew up, and they really feed into my work. And it's just something that continues to be prevalent in my work and in the inspiration for my work. There's a lot I don't understand about how a memory can ultimately feed into a painting and the end result be, you know, a painting, because this is obviously not a place necessarily. It's obviously not a holiday. It's obviously not a person. But it's incredibly interesting and it's incredibly powerful how those memories do feed into the inspiration and the making of a painting. But I'm very aware that there's a lot that I don't understand, but I embrace that. I embrace the not knowing, and I thoroughly enjoy exploring that. I feel also that a memory, obviously, or what we feel is or can be abstract, or it is abstract. We don't remember necessarily photographically. What we feel, we don't necessarily know or can make sense of that. And that definitely sort of feeds into my paintings. We are extremely lucky to have the Ferrans Art Gallery in Hull, which has a fantastic collection. That's where I saw the painting that actually made me want to paint. I was at college studying a foundation course in art and design, and I went to the Ferrans Art Gallery and I saw David Hockney's painting, We Two Boys Together Clinging. Prior to seeing that painting, I thought that I might pursue graphics, but I saw David Hockney's painting and it had such an incredible effect on me. I believe what they call punctum, which is, I think the definition of punctum is when you are punched by emotion. And that painting certainly did have that effect on me. And that's when I decided that I would like to pursue painting and explore painting, something that I'm still doing to this day.
Hi, I'm Jill Tate. I'm an artist based in Newcastle. I'm also an architectural photographer. My art practice centres mainly around painting. I did art foundation at South Tyneside College, and from there went on to Northumbria University to study photography. And I was on the contemporary photographic practice course, which is quite fine art based. And that led me to do an artist placement with an architect's practice based in Newcastle, which then led into architectural photography. So it was never kind of planned, it just sort of went that way. So I was making photographic artwork for quite a while after university, but then the architectural photography business kind of took over, so that's quite commercial and took a lot of my time. And so my art practice kind of waned for a good few years. And then probably around 2013, I decided I wanted to start painting, but didn't have the confidence. So I kind of started doing some printmaking, and through printmaking sort of eased myself into painting. Started painting in about 2017, and obviously the architecture theme is present in my painting work. It's present in all my artwork, really, photography and painting. There's never been any people in any of my artworks, whether it was photography or painting. I've always been drawn to quite quiet imagery, quite still or empty spaces. When I started this current theme, the initial kind of idea was to make domestic-like spaces that had the feel of being made of clay or some kind of earth material, in the sense that everything is sort of morphed out of the one material, the one substance, which is why they're all monochrome. I tried around with a few different earth kind of colours, but finally realised that the terracotta colour was the one that really sort of appealed to me. And I read a lot of philosophy, and I'm interested in psychology and physics and things like that, so I'm interested in the big questions which can't really be answered. So my work is my way of sort of trying to visualize sort of bigger concepts or abstract concepts in terms of the mind and sort of interior and exterior spaces. So the mind as a room, perhaps, sort of contrasts between hope and fear and those kind of different experiences. So the play of light in terms of the bright sunlight and the dark shadows and the sort of uncertainty in the imagery, and that's kind of where that stems from. So when I had the initial idea in my mind about this kind of work that I wanted to start making, I realised I wasn't able to simply take it from my head onto the canvas, that I would need something in between. And I initially tried using SketchUp on the computer, the software, to make room scenes with furniture in, but then I realised I didn't want to spend another minute sat at the computer, so so that quickly went out the window. It's kind of evolved quite gradually over the past few years, and so that these paintings are based on photographs of model room scenes that I set up. Not with any kind of specific narrative or anything in mind, but more just intuitively positioning things and having a look through the camera and seeing what I like. And yeah, finding the balance between sort of too empty and too many bits and pieces in. I do enjoy, I enjoy the process of making my own little world.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a Leeds-based artist, and yeah, I guess my work deals with kind of architectural spaces and the perception of space and kind of in its interpretation. Often working with kind of in response to architectures which are maybe in a period of transition, so that are being, I don't know, in a state of ruin or redevelopment, or whose kind of intended function maybe no longer exists. Also this idea of kind of like potential futures that maybe never existed. So they're kind of objects for sculpture, sort of, or of sculpture, from sculpture. Yeah, in terms of process and media, kind of often working with a series of different recording methods, sort of tools and processes, and in particular casting, and using, in this case, Jesmonite, to record sections of the relocated plinths or statues, or plinths from the statues on Woodhouse Moor in Leeds. So these kind of Victorian statues were kind of positioned in front of Leeds Town Hall originally, and they were moved to make way for a car park and a kind of a road, basically. So these moulds are kind of cast sections or paths between parts of the architecture or parts of the details of the plinths, using Jesmonite. I guess I see them as kind of these objects which are between spaces, in a sense that the plinth is interesting because it is this device which is an attempt to kind of elevate these Victorian figures beyond, you know, society, and the plinth is this object, this sort of anti-human object, and kind of in between spaces, or that idea of kind of between. And I suppose the mouldings or the work that's made kind of communicates that, in that you're kind of drawn in by maybe the detail or the material, but actually they are quite, you know, the edges are, you know, sharp, jagged. There's a front and a back to them, which talks about, you know, the kind of the presented side and then the hidden element. And the work was first produced or was made in 2019 during the Yorkshire Sculpture International. The context of the Sculpture International and the context of kind of sculpture, or let's say sort of public monuments in Leeds, was sort of very much kind of centred around those particular statues. Was firstly because the show is sort of was within the Leeds Town Hall, so, and that's the site or the front of the Leeds Town Hall these statues were moved from, and this idea of kind of like almost sort of lost sculptural futures. I find that the idea of the plinth is interesting because it's sort of designed as an object that prevents us, the public, kind of engaging with the supposed figures to be celebrated. And I think that idea of those spaces is really interesting, and actually working within them. I think there's a sort of a really strange, because now that these figures are kind of in the middle of or kind of dotted across Woodhouse Moor in Leeds, which is kind of an open park land, really. There isn't any, they're very much out of their natural habitat. Normally you see these kind of monuments within cities or city centres, whereas now they're kind of dotted in these sort of open landscapes, which is sort of very interesting in a sense that it's almost as though the city hasn't been built yet. And I think this kind of unexpected, space to see these objects, I think is interesting. All the sculptures don't, suggest any solutions to some of the issues and the kind of concerns. They kind of start to maybe debate and raise questions, to engage with the idea of public monuments and sculpture throughout a city and how we are kind of represented.